started, but before that, so guys, this is our 33rd. Some echo coming in. Emma, is your...
Sorry, that's me. I'll mute myself.
Yeah. Okay. So welcome, guys. We've got a really celebrated author with us this evening for our 33rd episode. And I'll ask Raji to do the introductions. So over to you, Raji, and then Arun can take over the show.
Yeah. Good evening. We have the pleasure of having with us none other than Aroon Raman today with us, an ex-Arborite. I think most of you seem to know him. We have, of course, known him for many, many years, been super entertained by his innumerable life stories from his JNU days and his activist Aroon Raman stories in Tihar jail, in a day in Tihar jail where he had, I think, foods which were served to Charles Sobraj and him. But the best part was he found
Raji, not
his wife there.
Not one day. I was there for 9 days. So
9 days, is it? Okay, I forgot that. And that's where he also met his wife as part of the
in Tihar jail.
In Tihar.
No,
because she was
okay.
And then of course his stories at Wharton and the US. But on a more serious note, Aroon is an entrepreneur who ran his family transformer insulation materials company, the Raman boards, for many years, sold it to ABB, and then set up Raman Fiber Science, a design and development company for high performance battery separators in hybrid electric cars, all first of a kind in the world products. Now Aroon is associated with many NGOs and startups, both financially and assisting in their operational outcomes. But now, mainly he's back to his main original passion of writing. A mystery thriller writer, Hindustan Times called him the Robert Ludlum of Indian thriller. His three books, The Shadow Throne, The Treasure of Kafur, and Skyfire, all published by Pan Macmillan, all of which are national bestsellers. Skyfire was recently made into an 8-part net series by Z5. His novel is targeted at the North American thriller market. Over to Aroon. We are looking forward. Thanks so much for agreeing to speak to us today.
thank you very much, Raji, and very good to be here tonight. Without further ado, let me start by recounting to you an extremely interesting story. The amazing thing about Indian history is a huge amount of thrills and extraordinary things have happened in the sidelines. Typically, we all did not like history in school. We thought it was deadly dull and boring, and it was because of the way it was taught. But as I grew up and got interested in looking at the sidelines of history, footnotes, sidelines, behind the scenes action, I found again and again extraordinary thrills and chills. And since I've started to travel all over the country on my NGO work and even my corporate work in the earlier days, I've always made it a point to visit some historical site or the other. And it has been simply sort of stunning as to the kind of tales that I have learned from these various visits. This particular tale was told to me by an old man when I visited Allahabad, but more to that towards the end of the talk. Let me tonight take all of you to a night of October 27th, 1605. We are now starting our story at the great fort in Agra. In the royal chambers, or the zenana, the royal harem, a man is lying on his bed. It is very clear that he's sinking. Before him stands a much younger man, dressed very richly, in rich robes, standing deferentially before the man on the bed. And a lot of other hakims or royal physicians are standing around the bed. The man opens his eyes with a lot of effort, and his eyes fall on the younger man in front of him. He very feebly, weakly beckons him forward. And as the younger person comes forward, he drapes a robe around his shoulder. An attendant hands him the robe, he drapes it around the younger man's shoulder, places a turban on his head, and hands him a gilded sword. His head falls back and his eyes close forever. In the latticed parda screens on the other side of the zanana, loud wails break out, loud cries from the women behind. And these cries mark the end of one of the greatest reigns in the history of India, the reign of Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, who ruled India from 1556 to 1605, an incredible span of 50 years, which saw the establishment of one of the largest empires that Hindustan, India has ever seen. There are only two monarchs who have the appellation the Great after their name. The first is Ashoka, more than 2000 years before Akbar, or let's say 1,000 odd years before Akbar. And the other one is Akbar himself, Akbar the Great. But for all his extraordinary accomplishments at empire building, creating a syncretic polity, building an extraordinary group of people around him, winning enormous renown, Akbar had his faults. He was such an extraordinarily dominating personality, so big, so larger than life, so strong-willed, that he cast a huge shadow like a banyan on everybody around him. Akbar had three sons: Salim, the eldest, in 1569, Murad in 1570, and Danial in 1572. So great was Akbar's overpowering shadow that Murad and Danial took to opium and alcohol very early in their lives. It was as if they were struggling to prove themselves in the shadow of their great father, and they soon became completely hopeless. They died very early due to addiction. That left Akbar towards the end of his life with only his eldest son, Salim. The great worry for Akbar in the last 5-6 years of his life, that is somewhere around 1600 onwards, was that Salim was also going the way of his other brothers. He was beginning to drink heavily, wine laced with afim or opium. He was little interested in matters of state, and in fits of rage, Salim was capable of acts of great cruelty to all around him, to the point where Akbar began to despair of the succession. If you look at a contemporary portrait of Akbar at that time, he is always seen as a dynamic, full of life person. But what you can see here is a profoundly pulled down, sad, pensive, and troubled Akbar. The main challenge was, of course, before him, the incredible imperial edifice that he had built over 50 years was in danger of falling apart if he did not find an appropriate successor. Salim was increasingly found to be, by most of the Umra or the nobles of the empire, they did not find Salim fit to rule as an emperor. But Akbar's eyes had already fallen on Salim's eldest son, the Prince Khusrau. The son was everything that the father was not. If you look at another contemporary portrait of the time, I don't know whether 1 minute, I'm just trying to pull this. Yeah, this will be a little better. You can see that it's an aged Akbar sitting to the left, and next to him is Salim, the heir apparent. But you can already see from this portrait that Salim does not look dynamic. He looks weak, somehow pulled down, dissolute, because he has been continuously he has been drinking and he has been addicted to opium. So in the last years of his life, to add insult to injury, Salim has been leading a series of rebellions against his father, thus splitting the court between father and son. By contrast, Salim's eldest son was the Prince Khusrau. Khusrau, unlike his father, was a brave commander, an able man, very much popular, liked by everybody, particularly the people of the empire, the common man, and he was also a very, very good general. So here you had a contrast between Salim, the father, and Khusrau, the son. So Akbar gradually began to come around to the view that after his death, it should be Khusrau who succeeds to the throne and not Salim. By 1603, a foreign observer at the Mughal court, Manucci, an Italian observer, described the Mughal court as a snake pit of intrigue and poison. The court had been divided into two, the camps of the father Salim and the camp of the son Khusrau. Khusrau was backed by some very, very respected senior nobles of the empire. Aziz Khan Koka, a milk brother of Akbar and a very strong noble. His daughter was married to Khusrau. He backed Khusrau. Man Singh, the nephew of Jodhabai, one of the emperor's wives, backed Khusrau, and many nobles had backed him. So Khusrau's star was clearly rising. He himself felt that he was definitely going to succeed his grandfather over his father, such that Khusrau began to address his own father as Bhai rather than as Baap. However, Salim had the backing of another very, very powerful group at court, the Begums in Akbar's Zenana. Akbar was known to have a soft spot for the key ladies of his harem. His mother, Hamida Banu Begum, the wife of Humayun, his aunt Gulbadan, his very senior wife, Salima Sultan Begum, and of course, the mother of Salim, Jodha. The women threw their weight behind Salim on the grounds that he was the eldest, and primogeniture meant that he should legitimately succeed the emperor. Such was the rivalry between father and son, such was the politicking and counter-politicking in the final days of Akbar, that Salim's wife Manbai, who was the mother of Khusrau, took poison and died. She committed suicide. She could not bear this terrible enmity that was driving apart her own husband, Salim, and her son Khusrau, and how it was dividing the court as the emperor, even as the emperor was starting to sink. In a move that was absolutely brilliantly cunning and beautifully executed, the Begums ensured on that fateful night of October 27th, as the emperor sank, they ensured that nobody would be in his chamber other than Salim. They made sure that the Hakims would keep on giving sort of, let's say, optimistic bulletins, but in reality, the emperor was fading, and at the time of his death, they ensured that the only face that Akbar saw was that of Salim. In his dying moments, Akbar had no choice but to anoint Salim as his successor. And within 3 days of this anointment, Salim ascended the throne of Hindustan as Nuruddin Jahangir Padshah Ghazi. And there was nothing that anybody could say because it was clear that the emperor himself had restored the turbans and the robe of office to Salim. The first thing that the new emperor did was to throw Khusrau in chains into the dungeons at Agra fort. You can imagine, therefore, the mind of the prince. Just 24 hours before, he had seen himself as the next emperor of Hindustan, and now he is a non-entity in the dungeons beneath Agra fort. This came, obviously, as a profound shock to the young prince, and he sank into what contemporary observers describe as the black hole of depression. Let us also not forget that his mother Manbai herself died of suicide, and she was known to be of a high-strung temperament. So a lot of people were commenting, no, Khusrau is also high-strung, he has depressive tendencies, and so on. And it was therefore not surprising that he should also sink into depths of despair, which is what was apparent to everybody who came into contact with him, even in the prison. But many nobles and others whose sympathies were with Khusrau told him to keep his spirits up. They said, do not despair. Bide your time, and we will guide you on how to strike back. So Khusrau tried to keep up his morale. His wife was with him. Aziz Khan Koka's daughter Aziza was his faithful companion in the dungeon. And 6 months passed in a relatively quiet fashion. During this time, Jahangir had consolidated his hold on the throne and felt less insecure about Khusrau. He thought Khusrau is now no longer a locus of power, no longer a threat, and he began to allow Khusrau some normal activities. One of those activities was to go and visit the tomb of Akbar in Sikandra. Those of you who have not gone to Agra, not seen Fatehpur Sikri, not seen Sikandra, please do so. There are some wonderful things to be seen and shared there, but that's for a different time. But one of the sites, as I was saying, this is the coronation of Jahangir, very famous portrait holding the globe in his hand as master of the universe. This is the tomb of Akbar at Sikandra, a very beautifully designed monument. And this is where Khusrau went every month to pay obeisance to his grandfather. So these trips were now routine, and they did not raise many eyebrows. So in April 1606, 1606, just 6 months after the coronation of Jahangir, Khusrau made his move. With a small group of trusted soldiers, about 100 of them, he set off to pay homage to Akbar at Sikandra. But just at Sikandra, he suddenly wheeled westward and started to move at speed towards Lahore. Immediately, word began to spread, and that indeed Khusrau had raised the banner of revolt, which he had. He raised his own standard, and word went out everywhere in Hindustan rapidly that Khusrau was amassing an army against the imperial army of Jahangir. Huge response to this call. Chieftains from all over the empire, from the Punjab, from Sindh, from Baluchistan, even from Gujarat, Rajasthan, flocked to the banner of Khusrau. An enormous army was swelling under his very eyes as they raced, or they tried to race, towards Lahore. The idea being to seize Lahore, form a new locus of power in Lahore, and then fight a decisive battle with the imperial forces under Jahangir. For once, though he was opium-ridden and not that decisive usually, Jahangir acted with speed and with decision. He sent a very powerful force under a top general, Muhabbat Khan, to pursue Khusro towards Lahore. And this army left at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, Khusro's army had become enormous, but it was a ragtag army. Hundreds of smaller chiefs had brought their own troops. There was no uniform structure of control. There was no unified battle strategy. Everybody was milling around in confusion. And this motley army also made the fatal mistake of stopping at the ashram of the Sikh Guru Arjan Dev to seek his blessings. In that stop alone, they lost 12 to 14 hours. And then again, they gathered themselves to move towards Lahore. But by that time, the courier pigeons and the imperial guard of Jahangir had reached Lahore fort, taken over and barred the gates to Khusro. Blocked from the entry to Lahore fort, and with the imperial army under Muhabbat Khan catching up from the rear, Khusro had no option but to turn and fight. In a very decisive battle that was held on 27th April 1606 on the banks of the Jhelum River at Attock, armies clashed. And as Terry, an Italian adventurer at court, observes, in pouring rain, which turned the ground into a soup of mud, the armies slithered and strained against each other for 2 hours. But the high discipline and tactics of Muhabbat Khan were completely outclassed the ragtag army of Khusro, and he was decisively defeated. And Khusro himself was dragged to Agra in chains. Jahangir's retribution was terrible. Contemporary portraits here you can see show this is a portrait of Khusro moving towards Lahore, surrounded by his army. It's a very interesting scenes. When he was brought back to Agra, Jahangir took the senior commanders of Khusro's rebel army and he had them impaled alive on sharp stakes. He lined them up on the roadside in screaming agony and made Khusro walk down that path to see personally the agony of his own commanders. To Khusro himself, he reserved another terrible punishment. Again, it is Manucci who observes that in an act within quotes designed to cause pain beyond all expression, Manucci says, Jahangir had 2 hot copper wires inserted into Khusro's eyes and had him blinded and again thrown into the dungeon. So thus was a popular prince of Hindustan destroyed, thrown from power, and again made a non-entity for all time to come. Or was it for all time to come? This is again a contemporary, not a contemporary, a subsequent portrait of Khusro. This time, of course, Khusro is shattered. He is blind. He is a prisoner completely under the most harsh confinement. And he has nothing more to look forward to in life. Jahangir himself feels some remorse after a few months at what he did to his own son. He sets his Hakims to try and cure or try and restore some part of Khusro's eyesight. But despite their best efforts, Khusro is, I would say, hardly is improved, but some light penetrates his eyes and he's able to see people as shadows through a mulmal screen. That's all. So he's blind for all intents and purposes, but some light comes and some shadows move across his eyeballs. But that's all. This chapter brings to an end once and for all this fight between father and son. But it is not the end of the story of Khusrau. Its greatest moments are yet to come. As I said, this 1606 is how it ends, with Khusrau blinded and thrown into the dungeon. 10 years pass. But it's very interesting to note that notwithstanding Khusrau being out of the public eye, his popularity remains undiminished in the country. Lot of rumors and stories have emerged about how, despite the copper wire being inserted into his eyes, Khusrau did not utter a single sound. His bravery then, his stoicism and courage despite being in imprisonment and blind, were all widely extolled in stories across the land. And Jahangir recognized the fact that his son continued to remain a popular figure in public imagination. So he made it a point. Anytime he went out in procession in Agra, he had Khusrau dragged along behind his elephant in chains, so that the public would know that Khusrau was a non-entity, was bereft of power, had nothing whatsoever to offer to anybody. Thus, 10 years passed and we come to the year 1616. By this time, however, Jahangir's health has been sinking. Jahangir is more and more under the influence of wine. And can anybody here who's listening to this talk tell me who is the real owner of, the real ruler of Hindustan by this time? Anyone?
Noor Jahan.
Noor Jahan, the senior wife of Jahangir. Not only the whole background of Noor Jahan is not only extraordinarily fascinating, but she is often portrayed in history as this very sort of cold, power-grabbing, ruthless, wicked kind of a person in many accounts. While some of that was true, she also had some extraordinary qualities. She had supreme loyalty to those who gave loyalty to her. She was an extraordinarily able administrator who held the empire in a sure grasp. Jahangir had given up all his administrative powers to her. She was the first woman empress to strike coins in her own name. She was a businesswoman of great ability and acumen, conducting a multinational business empire across the seas and across many lands. She was also an architect, and the tomb of Itimad-ad-Dawla, her father in Agra, is an architectural marvel and is worth seeing, even today, as one of the supreme aesthetic creations of her reign. She was also a poet of no mean repute. She wrote under the pen name Makfi, the Veiled One, and she was very well known for her amazing poetry. So this was a woman of many parts, and also a woman of great ambition who wanted to ensure that she retained control of the throne after the death of her husband, Jahangir. But by 1616, there was a serious threat to her hold on power. And that is the son of Jahangir there's another son apart from Khusrau. Khusrau's half-brother was the Prince Khurram, who would be known later on as the Emperor Shah Jahan. Khurram was also an amazingly able general. He had defeated a string of kingdoms in the Deccan and was his star was rising, and his father implicitly relied on him as the next successor. Now, this is where it becomes very interesting. For a long time, Khurram and Noor Jahan had an uneasy but working relationship. They were maneuvering against each other, but neither was ready to make the move. In 1616, Nur Jahan came up with her masterstroke. She went in secret to Khusro in the dungeon. And she told him, by the way, let me also tell you that Nur Jahan was married before she married Salim, Jahangir, and she had a daughter by her previous marriage, Ladli Begum. She told Khusro, if you are prepared to marry Ladli, then I will back your claim to become the next emperor of Hindustan. And it will happen. Believe me, she said, I have enough hold on your father that I can make it happen. And in fact, it was true. She had a complete hold on the emperor. So this came as a bolt from the blue to Khusro, who had given up all hope. And suddenly, the Empress of Hindustan is meeting him in secret and saying, marry my daughter, and you will be the next emperor after your father, who's sinking very fast anyway. Now, if you look at the circumstances of Mughal India at that time, this is a no-brainer. What in business or anything else in today's parlance, we would say, it was a done deal. Because what is before Khusro today? Let me present the other side of the picture, the danger that is ever present before Khusro. Khurram is already beginning to maneuver for the throne. He knows that Nur Jahan is also maneuvering. So he also knows that a titular popular figure that stands in his way is the figure of Khusro because of his extreme popularity with the public and the court. He needs to get Khusro out of the way. So he's been steadily working on Jahangir to hand over custody of Khusro to him in Burhanpur in the Deccan. Of course, we all know what that means. For someone as ruthless as Khurram, it means that ultimately the death of Khusro is inevitable. But Nur Jahan now tells Khusro, look, your brother Khurram has often been pushing for you to be transferred to his custody to your certain death. But I, Nur Jahan, have blocked it. If you now agree to my proposal, then together we will ensure your succession. Of course, this is an extraordinary event. And Aziza, who is Khusro's wife, faithful wife, all through 15 years, let me also add this and say this. It's very important to say, Aziza did not once leave Khusro's side. Not once. In fact, because of her faithfulness to Khusro, she won widespread admiration in the Mughal court. In fact, the Begums of Akbar and the Begums of Jahangir all loved Aziza and protected her. And for her, they also protected Khusro. Such was the character of Aziza, who all along was so devoted, and as a couple itself, they were profoundly devoted to each other. So Aziza throws herself at Khusro's feet and says, take this. Save yourself. Even if you don't become emperor, it doesn't matter, but your life will be saved. And in a stunning response to Nur Jahan and her clique, Khusro replies with only one word, no. You have to understand that this is a time when Mughal princes had hundreds of women in the harem. They had many wives, they had lesser wives, they had concubines. So it was completely accepted practice. And for Khusro to have entered into even a political alliance with Ladli Begum was enough, because political marriages were also the norm at that time. But Khusro said no. His wife pleaded with him. But again, as the Italian Terry says, right throughout 1616, 1617, Nur Jahan, her brother Asaf Khan, Aziza, and some others too, begged and pleaded with Khusro. But Terry says, within quotes, the prince could never be prevailed upon to change his mind. He steadfastly refused, and he said, not even in a political alliance can I contemplate another woman other than Aziza. There is no place for anybody else in my life other than her. For 2 years, the plotters tried, and finally, towards the end of 1617, Nur Jahan gave up. And upon her giving up, she withdrew her objections to Jahangir for the transfer of Khusrau to the Deccan and into the care of Khurram, his half-brother. Khusrau was now a man on borrowed time. Soon, he was transferred, and Shah Jahan, as he was by then well known, already known, the Prince Shah Jahan, immediately took custody of Khusrau and moved him to the Deccan. And now, some time passed in complete suspense, because everybody knew that the end of Khusrau was near. The only question was when. And that question was answered in January 1622. Khusrau was lying in his bed in Baranpur fort when several men burst through the door to his chambers. One of them was a man who would become infamous later in history, was the chosen assassin of Shah Jahan called Raza Bahadur. Raza Bahadur and his men jumped on Khusrau in the bed. Despite his blindness, Khusrau fought back bravely, but to no avail. He was stabbed repeatedly all over the body and then laid as if he was sleeping on the cot. And they all exited as they came. Aziza found him the next morning, and her shriek of agony, it is said, reverberated throughout Baranpur fort. Word flashed like lightning all over Hindustan. Shah Jahan wrote a letter to his father saying, "Your Majesty, I regret to say that your son Khusrau died at night due to colic and indigestion." To which the father callously replies, "My son, I don't mind the fact that you killed your brother. What I mind is that you think I'm stupid enough to believe you." So callously was the father's reaction to the son's death. But so great was the popular grief throughout the country that even Salim was rattled, Jahangir was rattled, and he ordered the body to be put in a coffin and transferred to Allahabad to be buried next to his mother, Manbai. Even as the burial convoy left Baranpur, huge crowds gathered everywhere. Every place where the convoy halted, a small shrine sprang up in memory of Pir Khusrau. And it looked like a small religious cult would start springing, not a small one, a big one, would start springing around Khusrau. Jahangir could not have that. He broke up all those crowds, smashed everybody inside, smashed all the little mausoleums that had come up, and hurried the body to Agra, to Allahabad, where it was interred next to the mausoleum of Manbai. With time, all was forgotten in the struggle for Jahangir's succession, and Khusrau Khurram, Shah Jahan waded through blood. He had already killed Khusrau. Now he successively killed Dawar Bakhsh, Khusrau's son. He killed Parvez, he killed Shahryar, Jahangir's other sons, and he killed their sons and waded to the throne in a river of blood. In all this, the fate of Khusro was forgotten. And thus came to an end a unique, courageous, but ultimately tragic life. It can be said that the life of Prince Khusro was ultimately a doomed life, a life of failure. But I personally, I look back and I think back to another Khusro, a famous poet of the 13th century, 13th and 14th century. And Khusro once wrote, Khusro darya ka ulti wahi dar. Khusro, the river of love, runs in very strange directions, in opposite directions. Khusro darya prem ka ulti wahi dar. Jo utra so doob gaya, jo dooba wo par. Only he who gets down will sink, and only he who sinks in that river can get to the other side. So when I stand at Agra and look across the Jamuna, on the far side, you see a shining light. And that is the light, that is the testimony to the centrality of one love. It is a great irony of history that today we are all celebrating the Taj Mahal and all that. Shah Jahan's love of Mumtaz Mahal, all that is greatly extolled and all that happens, which is true. Shah Jahan was very devoted to Mumtaz. But after Mumtaz, he had many wives, many concubines, many relationships. So by no means was he a completely monogamous man. But if there is a monument to love, the centrality of one in India, we must look to Khusro Bagh and not to the. Thank you, everybody. That's a quick story of. Sorry.
Your internet went off in the last bit, I think. Anyway.
Your audio was very choppy.
Yeah, that last.
Oh, okay. So
The last.
I only want. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Did you hear the little couplet of Amir Khusro that I said?
Yeah, we heard that.
Yes.
Yes.
So I just want to say that Khusro Bagh is the monument more than the Taj Mahal, which is held up as this monument of love of Shah Jahan for Mumtaz. It is Khusro Bagh, which is the monument to Khusro that has to be celebrated if you want to celebrate the fidelity of a husband for his wife.
So who built that? Khusro Bagh?
This was built, for Khusro
Later.
Bagh's father only.
Okay.
This is a turn of the century photograph, by the way. This is taken in the 1800s. Now it's completely restored. Khusro Bagh is very restored. So when I went to visit Anand Bhavan, somebody said you should visit Khusro Bagh. Many years ago, I went there and an old gentleman met me on the steps, a guide. And he said, "Aap Khusro ke baare mein jante hain?" I said, "No, I've never heard of. I've heard of Amir Khusro." He said, "No, you should learn about Prince Khusro." That is how I read and came up upon the story. But it was also a trip where I must say I had many other wonderful experiences. I visited the birthplace of another extraordinary man. This is Rana Pratap country in the Aravallis. And I will tell you about that maybe another day. But this is the place where he was born. Again, I learned a lot about Pratap when I was researching my books. But this is the story of Khusro.
Is that the guy with
Brilliant.
Chetak, the horse?
Yes.
Rana Pratap, yeah.
Chetak, at the Battle of Haldigati. But I researched Pratap quite a bit for my novel, The Treasure of Kafur, which if you do have the time, please do pick it up. It's on Kindle and on regular physical edition. You can pick it up. And it's a researched book. I've researched Akbar's personality a lot, but I've also researched people like Meera, Pratap, who were great personalities in their own right.
Brilliant, Arun. Brilliant. I mean, I wish my history teachers were like halfway close to the way you presented all this, Wonderful. Really great. Thank you so much for sharing the story.
Thank you.
Yes. Arun, if I
You
may
could stop
ask-
sharing your screen
Yes.
now, I guess. Then we can.
Yeah, I'm just doing that.
Yeah.
1 minute, please. Hold on. How do I?
So we had
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
I
can
had
I
learned
Go
something about Khusro, but clearly some of the parts you filled in beautifully, I thought, which I had not heard about. But in some ways, I see his life mirrored in Dara Shikoh's life too.
Yes, yes. Very,
The
very,
really capable, wonderful people who were put to death by their siblings or even sometimes their father and so on because of the thirst for power.
correct. Which is where I,
What
yeah,
unfortunate fate.
unfortunate, but that's the way it was at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Might is right, I guess.
Might is right.
Arun, two quick observations and one question.
Yes.
I think the Mughals did a lot for what we see around culture, places in Delhi, art, but they also left palace intrigues and skullduggery, which our politicians seems to have inherited beautifully. I mean, any of what you described today, which we didn't know, is commonly practiced in political parties. And you think they are enemies, but they are friends, and shifting loyalties and palace intrigues are all learned from the Mughals. My second observation is that our history that we learned painted Jahangir as a weak guy, Shah Jahan as again somebody who was known only for the love and the monument he built. None of the ruthlessness of both these guys was even remotely in our history books, maybe overshadowed by the ruthlessness of Aurangzeb, who was still to come. And maybe that was of a different order that paled these guys' ruthlessness. And the question is that there was a phase when Jahangir had imbibed some of this transparent justice system. He had put that,
Prasad, can you repeat that, please?
There's an echo. There's an echo.
Okay, is it better now?
Prasad, can you repeat that?
Yeah, the question is to do with Jahangir's imbibing some of Akbar's transparent justice systems. He had put that bell outside his court, and that's what is often talked about. While people acknowledge that he was a weakling, but he did many things to allow the general public to seek justice. It's equivalent of our RTI Act many years ago. So,
see, for that, Prasad, we must also look to Akbar, because Akbar was a little bit, when you research him and you look at he had a great psychological depth, which is very interesting. See, he was one of those people, for example, when he married Jodha, but of course, after that, he married many Hindu women. He never insisted on conversion. All of them remained Hindus.
Arun, before you go any further, I wanted to please confirm, is Jodha Akbar really the person you're talking about? Because she's called by Miriam Al-Zamani and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of
her name
about who's Jodha.
Jodha is a popular name given to her. She was the daughter of Bharmari Mal of Amer. There are many other names also given to Jodha, not necessarily Jodha, but that she was an Amer princess is well known from the Kachwaha ruling family, right? But the good thing about a lot of the Hindu princesses at court was they continued to practice their religion. That was one. The other thing was Akbar was an absolute ruler. But if you look at, he had great, some astonishing qualities. For example, Aziz Khan Khoka was his blood brother. Not blood brother. He was not his blood brother. He was his milk brother. In those days, when a young prince was born, you gave a wet nurse who breastfed the child. So the milk mother's son was known as a milk brother. So, but Aziz Khan Khoka used to be very rude to Akbar in court. He used to abuse him and all that. So the courtiers were stunned. And they kept asking Akbar, how would you put up with this fellow's ill-mannered, so disrespectful ways? And Akbar said, what am I to do? The Khoka has tied my hands with a rope of milk. Right? So these are, which is not the case with Jahangir or with Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, certainly not. So he was a personality of much greater depth. And he was a mystic seeker in some ways and so on. He's a very much more interesting personality. The others were, not half as interesting as he was, at least from my readings of the Mughal period. But, you come across now only with understanding a little bit more, you see some subtleties coming across even in contemporary Hindu rulers of the time, even a little earlier. Krishnadevaraya is a very good example. We don't know enough about the Vijayanagar Empire. And it's one of my next hobbies that I must understand a little bit. Because Vijayanagar was just before Babur entered the scene. And of course, there is now a huge amount of literature on the Mughals and the British, but less so about some of the Deccan kingdoms, less so about some of the, even about the Chalukyas and so many. They left behind huge monuments, but we don't have these sort of behind the scenes psychological portraits are much harder to come by. So I would like
Cholas also. Cholas
Yeah,
would be an
Rajaraja Chola.
interesting.
Yeah, Tanjavur, the temple,
story.
and then we know hardly anything about
we
it.
don't know that much. I mean, I've read Ponniyin Selvan in
No,
Tamil
there is enough in
a
the
couple of times.
vernacular, but not in English.
Not in
That's
English.
the problem.
So when you read Ponniyin Selvan, it all comes alive to me. In Tamil, it's just amazing. But of
Hey,
course,
Arun, did you ever have a chance to visit National Archives at Tonk Road and in Tonk in Jaipur? I'll tell you why.
Mhm.
When William Dalrymple, when he talked about the Mughal emperors, he said most of his research he did came from the archives on the Tonk.
Yeah.
Did you also do something on that?
I did a lot of research, but to be honest, for my kind of books and things, I didn't have to go to the kind of depth that Dalrymple has done. He's done enormous amount of original research, including if you see his last Mughal, which is the life of the final days of the Mughal Empire under Bahadur Shah Zafar. There's a huge amount of Shikasta Urdu research that he's done, which is extraordinary. I'm nowhere in that category. I don't have the time or
Arun,
inclination.
professional historians don't like Dalrymple because he takes research done in Urdu and other things and gets them translated professionally and then uses them. So there are professional historians who think he's actually a good popularizer, and I love his books. I've read every one of his books.
Yeah. He's a popular writer. That's what it is.
Exactly. And he has rediscovered texts that we have ignored in
That's
India.
right. Mahmud Farooqi did it with him. So it's quite extraordinary. Yes, Mr. Muthraman, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah. Among the Mughal rulers, Akbar is one person who is very vastly different from everybody else.
Right.
See, Akbar was a very crude person. He is an illiterate guy. Humayun was a literate person, but extremely soft and extremely weak.
Weak.
Aurangzeb was a different kind.
Correct.
But this man is supposed to be very secular. He tolerated, he had Deen Ilahi. He had many facets in his career, which is completely different from the Mughal rulers that ruled India.
Correct.
And you must have done a lot of research on that. Why was he so different? Was he of the same clan, or was he somebody else who was brought from somewhere, or he had a different age? What exactly was he?
You see, the development of Akbar as someone who was so unique can only be speculated upon. The good thing is, Abul Fazl left a big account, the Aini Akbari, but it is all full of praise for Akbar. Akbar is a celestial human being in Abul Fazl's biography. Salim, the son, also wrote about his father at length. And he described his father, Akbar's flashing eyes, the fleshy mole on his nose, the extraordinary width of his shoulders, his physical courage and bravery. They're all very well documented, and they are documented even in folk songs. If you go to Uttar Pradesh today, they are still sung in many places. His development, see, partly he was born and came to the throne under the most difficult of circumstances. Whole of Hindustan was in revolt. He was 15 years old. Bairam Khan was this thing. So in some cases, by sheer chance, the personality gets molded by the circumstance. But how he became what he was is not well understood.
He is so different from his father. Humayun was such a weakling.
Yes, yes.
He couldn't fight a single war, and
It was said of Akbar that Humayun gave so little time to his son that his son became totally wild. And that early wildness, his ability to tame animals, to get into musk elephants, was all on the field. But by becoming like that, he was with the army all the time, became very rough and tough. No time for classes. He hated to read and write. And Humayun,
while he may have been tough and very rude, he was also had another side. He after all floated this religion, and he wanted to do something between the Islam and the Hinduism and all that.
See, he began to profoundly change in his late 20s.
Yeah.
In his late 20s. He became a very, very different human being. So this is it's a fascinating psychological development in the man.
Correct.
But one thing is very curious. I mean, from what you are describing, Khusrau seems to be a very smart, intelligent, able general. So how come he never thought that, okay, if his father has become ruler, next he will be in ruler? I mean, you just keep feeding him opium and the Jahangir will tap over in no time. So why didn't he just bide his time rather than try to all this intrigue and, just feed him some opium every day, kuch dinon mein sab jayega.
Unfortunately, maybe, in moments of extreme stress, right? And with the kind of power play in a Mughal court, often the right tactic or the right strategy that you will adopt to succeed the throne is not that clear. After all, one of the things that even when I give a talk like this to corporates, quite often I ask the corporate guy, what lessons do you guys learn, from some of these things? The essential ambiguity of the whole thing, the essential, the power play and the politics in large organizations, the fact that, for example, what happened was he took a long time to reach Lahore. Instead of moving very fast, he should not have stopped overnight at Arjan Dev's. In fact, Arjan Dev as a Sikh guru only blessed him. He didn't say, you are right to revolt. He didn't take his side. But so wild was Jahangir, he went and he beheaded Arjan Dev. He killed him. And so upset was the Sikh community that the consequences of that act have reverberated for centuries. That Arjan Dev, a holy Sikh guru, was beheaded by Jahangir just for giving blessings to anybody who comes to his ashram. Right? So there are multiple outcomes to a simple incident like that. Even that alone is worth exploring. So the rise of Gobind Singh and the Khalsa, some of it can be traced to the killing of Arjan Dev for essentially what was the act of
Tej Bahadur. And Tej Bahadur, I think.
Tej Bahadur too, subsequently.
And his two sons.
Yes. So it is the footnotes are filled with all kinds of very interesting side stories, which is where I like to travel actually. The main thing, the way we were taught history, I just keep on falling asleep. I think Sambar will remember Leela Rao and our history teachers and all. We just used to collapse.
She will be very proud of your achievement, Aroon.
And it hid all the truths.
Yeah, I mean, this is one governor general follows the other, one king follows the other. It's the same, nonsense. But we don't understand the struggle for succession, what it involves. In fact, that's why just before COVID lockdown happened last week, my wife and I spent 4 days at Ahilya Fort in Maheshwar.
Wow.
And it's when you realize, and obviously you want to get into Ahilya Bai Holkar, an amazing woman. Yeah. Late 18th century, she ruled 1767 to 1769 to 17.
Shibu, is that the same lady that?
Ahilya Bai Holkar.
Yeah. We read about it in another book recently.
Yeah, she's revived so many kshetrams. From Kashmir to Rameshwaram, she has done work. Extraordinary as a builder, but also a very secular, inclusive ruler. Loved by everybody in the empire. It is golden age of the Holkars at that time. Managed to keep enemies at bay, win over her population. Woman of great piety, but loved by everybody. And a woman at that, who just escaped committing sati. Because her father-in-law said that if you are not there, the empire will collapse. Because there's no successor. A woman who had a lot of personal tragedy. So living in Ahilya Bai's fort, in the hotel, and it so turned out because of lockdown, we were the only ones in the fort hotel. Nobody else. And there's lovely shrines inside. There is a Ganapati shrine below our room. You're overlooking the holy Narmada. There is a ghat. People are performing rituals. And we did a ritual, and I just went back and looked at it, and Shankara has sung about Narmada in the 8th century. So you can actually float an arti and you can sing a Shankara hymn if you wish. And the Narmada, Shankara has said, unlike the Ganga where you have to take a snan, the Narmada, all you have to do is to see it for punya and that kind of thing. So we spent 3-4 days there. So from Mughal times to this. Then we went to Mandu, which was the home of Baz Bahadur, which was again sacked by Akbar's half-brother, Adam Khan. So, it's in a space of 2-3 days, you get all facets of this country. And I'm reminded of a great couplet by, I think, Gorakhpuri, who said, yeah, Firaz Gorakhpuri. He said that something to the effect that everywhere in the world, Hindustan is the universe, right? So kafile guzarte gaye. The caravans of the world kept going and coming throughout history. Hindustan banta gaya. And that you can see even today. So I think this is it. And in my thing, at least, I like to end with another final quote, one of my favorites by Ghalib. Ghalib says, Zindagi bhar, Ghalib ek hi bhool karta raha. Throughout his life, Ghalib kept making only one mistake. Zindagi bhar, Ghalib ek hi bhool karta raha. Bhool chehre pe thi, magar aina saaf karta raha. I think these stories, in some extent, have to, reflect on our own lives, and that's what makes it enriching and very interesting.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to give Aroon a standing applause.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aroon. Fantastic talk. Yeah, loved it.
And hope we will have a get together physically one of these days. And
yes. Please do come to Arbors. Yeah, once we can meet together.
You can make another house now that you've met all of us.
Yes. I must tell you about my experiences in jail and meeting everybody there. That's a very different one.
Okay.
That would be another. We should schedule him right away. How to survive in a jail.
Next Saturday.
Okay, guys.
Actually coincided when Charles Shobraj is there.
Was there? Yeah, he was my director.
Did you meet him?
Yeah, many times.
Wow, interesting.
Not just once or twice, but many times. I learned things from him and also made friends with many other category C, pickpockets and petty thieves inside the prison. And amazing. I mean, for
rich material for book.
Rich material. And I was all the time interacting with my fellow prisoners. I mean, it was just amazing.
They all have stories.
And Afri was always trying to pull you back.
Well, she was in Tihar, Maine, which is where Mrs. Gandhi was kept during the post-emergency period, Shah Commission period. She was kept in Tihar, Maine. So she was there. We were in Tihar camp, and it was a very grim, extremely grim experience.
This is JNU, must be, na?
JNU, 1983. But Mrs. Gandhi was back in power. And man, I mean, if Mrs. Gandhi, memory of an elephant, so she gave Jagmohan, who was then the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi, strict instructions that we were to be given the 3rd degree. So 46 degrees in Delhi for the first 48 hours, for the first time in my life, no drinking water was allowed. So the body urine gets reabsorbed and you become heavily constipated. So I went in, I was 52 kilograms on day 1. Day 9, I was 42. So those of you who want to lose weight, just tell me.
You got a special room for that, is it? Okay.
I can make arrangements.
Okay. Right, guys. Good night. Thank you so much. Fantastic evening.
Thanks, Shibu,
for doing
Good night. Bye.
Thanks, Arun. Yeah, thanks, Raji.